after the Israeli units entered Lebanon to destroy the Hezbollah forces operating from the Shia-dominated regions of the country, the spectre of a large regional war haunts the Middle East once again. One of the most crucial players behind the complex web of interconnected military, economic, religious and ethnic relations that one has to navigate through when trying to understand this fascinating and unstable region is the Islamic Republic of Iran, a current title for a state that has been for thousands of years, at least in the Western tradition, known by a different name, Persia. Iran is a multi-ethnic country of almost 90 million people and the epicenter of the Shia branch of the Islamic faith, the second largest strain of this major world religion. In the current consciousness of people in the West, Iran is often thought of as the fundamentalist rogue state, plotting to expand its regional influence at the expense of the United States, hell-bent on destroying Israel while simultaneously withstanding massive international economic sanctions, and competing for influence with the countries considered the leaders of the largest branch of Muslim faith, the Sunni Islam. Now, whatever one might think of Iran, I have always thought that, if nothing else, this is an impressive level of multitasking. However, under these events, capturing the headlines of news articles across the globe lies, as always, another reality, hidden from many observers, the demographic one. As usual, the hidden undercurrents of demographic development can often tell us more about the trajectory of a given society than one could expect. And the demographic development of Iran in the past century has been truly quite fascinating. In 1980, Iran had one of the world's highest population growth rates, around 5%. However, between 2015 and 2050, Iran is projected to record the second highest percentage growth of the population aged over 60 years on the planet, just slightly behind South Korea. Iran is known for its proclivity for revolutions. There were two in the 20th century. The constitutional revolution that took place between 1905 and 1911, and the famous Islamic Revolution of 1979. But there has been another, not so well-known demographic revolution that took place in Iran. Between 1980 and 2000, Iran recorded one of the fastest declines in fertility rate in human history, from close to 7 children per woman in the early 1980s to under 2 in the early 2000s. The only competitors for Iran in the discipline of massively reducing family sizes are East Asians. So, let's delve into the demographic story of Iran. Iran is the third majority Muslim country I am making a video about. The first two were Turkey and Kazakhstan. Since it is a country which is called the Islamic Republic and is considered, at least partially, a theocracy, it will be the first one where I will in real depth talk about the anthropological basis of Middle Eastern Muslim countries, dictated by their traditional family systems as outlined by the one and only Emmanuel Todd. Now, most of my regular viewers have heard this a couple of times, but for the newcomers, I will nevertheless explain the basics of his theory once again. Emmanuel Todd is a French anthropologist and demographer who developed a theory based on the assumption that traditional peasant family types prevalent in the different societies in the pre-modern era have massively influenced the political behavior of these societies once they modernized and the masses of previously illiterate rural populations entered the realm of politics. The basic argument says that people unconsciously form their general views on life, society and politics by what they experience in their early life within their family circle. The treatment of children by their parents largely influences what is then perceived as a just social order in the realm of politics. There are three basis axes in play here. The first is whether there is a strong paternal authority over the children, even in adulthood, which predisposes societies to liberalism if there is not a strong authority past childhood, or to authoritarianism if there is one. The second defining axis is the relationship of the siblings, which can be either egalitarian or not. That is most commonly expressed in matters of inheritance. Some family systems had fixed cultural rules on the equal inheritance of the siblings. Some left this matter entirely to the will of the individual parents, and some practiced primogeniture, so the model in which the oldest sibling inherits everything and the others get nothing. This axis determines society's views on the equality of people in general. The basis thesis says that if you grew up in a family and culture that perceives siblings as equal, you would tend to perceive men in general as equal, even though they might be of different cultures, ethnic groups, or races. The third main axis is whether there is a taboo on marriages between cousins in place, or if these marriages are widely practiced and preferred. This axis significantly influences the position of women in the family and society in general, as well as the ease with which modern bureaucratic states are formed. Different combinations of these three traits, equality, authority, and cousin marriages, create the main family systems in the world. Now, the family type prevalent in Iran, as well as in a large chunk of the Muslim world, is the so-called endogamous clan family. The first thing to understand about this family type is that it is not actually Muslim per se. It significantly predates the ascension of Islam and was practiced long before that among the Arab tribes and also other Middle Eastern peoples. It was, however, likely spread together with the spread of Islam and the Arab ethnicity out from the Arab Peninsula to the wider Middle Eastern region from the 7th century on. It is thus almost universally prevalent within the heartland of the Muslim faith in the Middle East and North Africa. There are nevertheless significant regions where Islam is prevalent, which have different family types, and the character of these societies is thus often quite distinct from the Islam heartland. Examples are the more peripheral Muslim regions in Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, the Balkans, and Southeast Asia. The basic characteristics of the exogamous clan family are the cohabitation of sons and their families within a single household with their father, the equal division of inheritance between male descendants, and the preference for first cousin marriages dictated by custom, specifically for the preference of marrying your son to the daughter of your brother, if possible. If you do not have a brother or he does not have a daughter, you turn to first cousin, second cousin, and so on. In Todd's view, the fundamental anthropological division between the Christian and Muslim worlds is not rooted in any explicit religious differences. Christianity and Islam are both universalist Abrahamic religions, which are likely more similar than different when the overall diversity of religious traditions across the world is considered. But precisely in the polarity of family types it preferred. Christianity dogmatically insisted on exogamy, so a strict taboo against cousin marriages, while Islam thrived in areas where endogamy was deeply rooted. Moreover, in the Quranic law, the inheritance is divided not only between brothers, but into small parts and spread over the wider family unit, thus further strengthening its cohesion, even though this element is weaker in the Shiite tradition than in the Sunni one. Now, according to the elaborate laws of inheritance laid out in the Quran, the division of inheritance between sons should be egalitarian, while daughters should receive half share. In practice, daughters were excluded altogether in the Middle Eastern family type. The traditional family arrangements thus takes preference over the explicitly theologically prescribed way of doing things. Polygamy, a practice very often connected to Islam in the minds of Westerners, was actually not very widespread and affected only a very small number of the population, since only the richest and most powerful men could sustain more wives. Polygamy was truly widespread only among Muslims in Black Africa, but there, it was also a residue of traditional family systems not connected primarily to Islam. One of the best ways to show the distinctness of the different family types is by comparison. So, I will compare it with the other widespread clan family type, the exogamous clan family prevalent in the large portion of Eurasia, stretching from Eastern Europe all the way to China. While both family types share the cohabitation of married sons and their families under the father's roof and the equal division of inheritance, the extent of the father's authority differs significantly. While in the clan family of the Russian and Chinese types, the authority of the father over his sons was powerful, almost absolute, in the Middle Eastern family type, the authority of the father is significantly weaker, because one of the most important powers he could exercise over his children, the selection of their spouse, is dictated by custom, that the father is merely executing. That also ties together with another major difference, which is the position of women within the family and society. Now, in the sort of traditional view of most Westerners, Islam is seen as a civilization with a remarkably low position of women. They are subordinate to their husbands, they often hide their faces behind veils or scarves, and so on. But, from the anthropological point of view, things do not seem to be so clear-cut. The Middle Eastern family type may be the most protective and capable of integrating the individual, including women, out of all the major family types. While in the other clannish family type, the Eurasian one, women leave their families altogether to become wives of a stranger and an alien part of a different family, subordinated both to their new husband, his father, and potentially also tyrannized by their new mother-in-law. In the ideal Middle Eastern family type, she never really leaves the family. Her new father-in-law has always been her uncle, her new husband has always been her cousin, and her new mother-in-law has always been her aunt. She is controlled and subordinated, largely excluded from public life, but also protected. So, while the position of women in this family type is very far from the newly championed Western ideal of gender equality, it still is, according to Todd, significantly better than in China or India. That can be demonstrated by the widespread practice of female infanticide in China or North India, in recent times also executed through selective abortions due to the technologically available screenings for the sex of the newborn. In these regions, the sex ratios at birth are incredibly skewed towards male babies, which cannot be to the same extent said of the Middle East. Moreover, when we look at the statistics regarding wife killing, specifically the percentage of women that were murdered where the perpetrator was their husband, we find that it is by far the highest in Southeast Asia, which includes India in the WHO division, where 55% of all murdered women were murdered by their husbands. However, even in high-income countries, including the EU or the USA, this statistic is higher than in the Middle Eastern region. But there are also other indicators showcasing the protective nature of the Middle Eastern family type, most notably the low prevalence of suicides. Middle East is a region with one of the lowest prevalences of suicide in the world. The relatively high levels of suicide in Muslim countries like Kazakhstan, Bangladesh, or the sub-Saharan African Muslim countries suggest that it might have more to do with the family type prevalent in the area rather than with Islam as such. The Middle Eastern family type is universalist and egalitarian, based on the solidarity and equality of brothers and cousins and the exclusion of women, which are nevertheless still protected from many of the excesses common in other family types. It is inward-looking, remarkably resistant, and highly protective of its members. But it also has certain significant issues. In the work of Emmanuel Todd, but also in the book Weirdest People in the World by Joseph Heinrich, the idea is developed that societies with clannish families and high prevalence of arranged cousin marriages have significant troubles with the establishment of the bureaucratic, impersonal modern state. The family type lacks the strong vertical power relationship between a father and son, present in the authoritarian family type of Germany and Japan, as well as in the Russian and Chinese clan families. The constant creation of new unions of previously unrelated people, husbands and wives, acts as a sort of model of the impersonal bureaucratic relations of a modern state, since it presupposes social relations functioning on different bases than kinship. This element is lacking in the Middle Eastern family type, where the broad extended family full of elaborate cross-cousin relations is paramount. It creates strong, self-regulating societies with weak states. The main loyalties of people remain dedicated to their extended family network or clan, which tends to get preference over the impersonal loyalty to a bureaucratic state. This decentralized horizontal network is also reflected in the decentralized organization of Islam, which is so different from the highly centralized and bureaucratized Catholic Church, one of the oldest surviving impersonal bureaucracies in the West, where the principle of celibacy makes kinship-based relations basically impossible. The lack of strong vertical power dynamic of the authority of the father over his sons is a double-edged sword of sorts. On the one hand, it does not instill the societies with the discipline and obedience to authority common for other family types. But it also does not produce the neurosis that this power relationship often produces, as was showcased on the very low prevalence of suicide. Due to the egalitarian and universalist nature of this family type, Middle Eastern societies usually tend to politically go either for socialism, as in the case of Algeria, Syria, Iraq or Egypt, or Muslim fundamentalism, as in the case of Iran, after their modernization. Often, they tried socialism first, and fundamentalism arrived after that. However, the Middle Eastern socialism lacked the totalitarian statist element common in the Soviet Union or China, and it also lacked their militant anti-clerical atheism. The revolt against God, which, in the sort of Freudian analysis by Todd, represents the omnipotent authority of the Father, has not happened in the Muslim world. Now, one of the crucial concepts in Todd's anthropological and demographic analysis is the transition crisis. What it means is the period of profound ideological disorientation and chaos that occurs when societies undergo the first major wave of modernization, which is usually profoundly connected to mass literacy. Achieving mass literacy is one of the prerequisites for any kind of technological and political modernity, and it is almost always one of the sociological phenomena predating the fall in fertility rates, significant decline in religiosity, and rising age at marriage. But it is also usually connected to large-scale ideological upheaval and possible political mayhem. The masses of peasants, up to date contained to the static world of rural illiterate poverty and high religiosity, which nevertheless also provided a significant level of stability and ideological grounding, suddenly started to burst onto the scene of mass politics, moving to cities, educated and agitated by their ability to read. Old certainties are shaken by the sudden explosion of new impulses. In these transition periods, the ideological and political impacts of the family types can be most resolutely seen. The memories of rural upbringing in the traditional family arrangements are still alive in the minds of millions of newly literate and often urbanized people. The median ages of the population are also usually very young in these periods, since these times usually occur either during or shortly after the high growth phase of the demographic transition. People then look to the state to establish an order resembling their former family type. Societies with traditionally authoritarian and non-egalitarian families went for similarly authoritarian and non-egalitarian, often ethnically based ideologies, like German Nazism or Japanese imperialism. Societies with family types that combined egalitarian division of inheritance and authoritarianism, like Russia or China, went for an ideology reflecting these values, communism. Societies with weak authority of parents over their children tended to go for liberalism, either the more non-egalitarian version of the Anglosphere or the more revolutionary French version, trying to combine egalitarianism and liberalism. In the Middle Eastern Muslim world, this wave of modernity came significantly later than in the West or even Russia and China. To focus on the example of Iran, a literacy rate of over 50% for males was achieved in 1964 and for females in 1981. 15 years after the majority of Iranian men achieved literacy, the Shah's regime collapsed. A couple of years after the majority of Iranian women achieved literacy, fertility began to decline. The crisis of transition in the Middle Eastern Muslim world was highly specific, precisely due to the nostalgia felt for the old pre-modern social arrangements dictated by faith and customs. That contrasts sharply with the militantly anti-religious and anti-clerical nature of similar transition crises in France, Russia, or China. The wave of Muslim fundamentalism that the world has been grappling with in the past half a century, and that also manifested in the 1979 Iranian Revolution, is a paradoxical product of modernity. Its strongest supporters were never the rural masses still living in the warm remnants of traditional life, but urban and often college-educated Muslims operating in the suddenly changed sociological framework. One of the characteristics of this ideology was that it was remarkably successful among scientists and technically educated people. To a large extent, Muslim fundamentalism is an ideology born out of their effort to rebel against modernity, especially in the cities of the Muslim world, where the breakdown of traditional family patterns is always most pronounced. And Iran truly underwent a modernization of gargantuan proportions during the 20th century. In 1900, Iran had 12 million people, thinly spread on a territory almost 5 times larger than contemporary Germany, 80% of whom were rural and 94% of whom were estimated to be illiterate. The infant mortality rate was 500 per 1,000 live births, so half of all newborn babies died in infancy. Between a quarter and a third of the population was composed of nomads. Life expectancy was 30 years. There were 325 kilometers of paved roads, 12 kilometers of railroads, and no electricity. 2,000 people were enrolled in public schools. The country lacked a centralized government and was ruled on the basis of a complex web of decentralized feudal institutions, in which the power of the Qajar dynasty's central government did not reach far from the capital of Tehran. The Qajars lacked salaried professional bureaucracy, and most of their ministries were empty shells, with no means of executing centralized power. The Qajars balanced the various locally based communal ethnic, religious, clannish and tribal interests. Iran was, and still is, a very ethnically diverse place. At the time, Persians accounted for roughly half of the population, with Azeris, Kurds, Lurs, Arabs, Turkmen or Balok being the most populous groups after that. But there was a large number of smaller ethnic and tribal groups. Most communities were geographically very isolated, and many of them were self-sufficient in terms of food production as well as in many other ways. Iran was a deeply pre-modern country. Today, Iran has close to 90 million people, an infant mortality rate of 13 per 1,000 live births, and a life expectancy of 75 years. 3/4 of the population live in cities. Less than 1% of the population remains nomadic, and the country has close to 1 million salaried civil servants. The country is on its way to universal literacy, has millions of university students, and is among the world's top producers of STEM graduates in numerical terms. Throughout the 20th century, Iran underwent an incredibly dynamic social and political transformation. While at the beginning of the century, a small, Western-oriented intelligentsia pushed through a classically liberal constitution inspired by a Belgian one, it only showed that however well-fleshed-out constitution is just a piece of paper, if imposed on a society that is not sociologically prepared for it. In the first 2 decades of the 20th century, Iran was a mess and a playground for foreign powers, especially the British and Russian empires. The modernization and the creation of a centralized bureaucratic state, whose power finally curbed the power of tribal chiefs, did place under the iron fists of 2 rulers from the Pahlavi dynasty, ruling the country from 1925 to 1979, basically as military dictators, also sustained by the USA and UK-backed military coup in 1953, which was enacted to stop the nationalization of the Iranian oil industry, and deepened already strong resistance of the population to Western meddling in the country's affairs. As the urban intelligentsia and industrial working classes expanded, the socialist ideology also gained ground among Iranians, especially in the 1940s. However, in accordance with Todd's analysis, it never encompassed the militantly anti-clerical atheist sentiments common among socialist and communist movements in the West. Interestingly enough, when the mass opposition to Shah's regime started to reach a tipping point in the 1970s, due to a combination of economic inequality and massive Tehran-focused centralization, religious opposition to secularizing tendencies of the regime, its general oppressiveness, and the disdain of the people for the Shah being in cahoots with Western powers, it was in a peculiar ideological mix of Shia Muslim fundamentalism merged with revolutionary socialist rhetorics. As the Western-educated sociologist Ali Shariati, one of the strong ideological influences behind the Islamic Revolution, claimed, the true essence of Shiism is a revolution against all forms of oppression, especially against feudalism, capitalism, and imperialism. According to Shariati, the Prophet Muhammad had been sent to establish not just a new religion, but a dynamic society in permanent revolution moving towards a classless utopia. The future Ayatollah Khomeini used revolutionary slogans such as Islam belongs to the oppressed, not the oppressor. Islam represents the slum dwellers, not the palace dwellers. Islam is not the opiate of the masses. The poor die for the revolution, and the rich plot against the revolution. The oppressed of the world unite. We are for Islam, not for capitalism and feudalism. Islam will eliminate class differences. Islam originates from the masses, not from the rich. In Islam, there will be no landless peasants. The duty of the clergy is to liberate the poor from the clutches of the rich. Sounds familiar? In anthropological terms, in accordance with Todd's theory, the masses of suddenly urbanized and literate poor immigrants from the rural areas living in metropolitan shantytowns created a fertile ground for the emergence of a new, highly religiously conscious and egalitarian ideology. But it is also true that throughout the 20th century, Iran managed to break the issues of many Middle Eastern societies with creation of strong, centralized states. Maybe also due to the fact that its borders were not random lines designed by Western powers, and it had strong ethno-national identity connected to the Persian past. Throughout the 20th century, all the way to the 1980s, Iran had a massive fertility rate, between 6 and 7 children per woman. The infant mortality rate started to decline significantly around the middle of the century, and Iran started to experience a population boom, typical for the high-growth phase of the demographic transition. In the 1960s and the 1970s, Shah pursued a westernization policy focused, among other things, also on the lowering of fertility rate by getting women into the education and labor force, and making contraception available. The fertility rate slightly decreased from over 7 to 6 children per woman. But these attempts were, however, brought to a halt by the Islamic Revolution of 1979. New leadership saw the attempts to decrease the population growth as a Western plot against Islam, closed family planning clinics, lowered the legal age of marriage from 14 to 9 years, segregated the sexes, and insisted on the traditional female role as mothers. The bloody and protracted war with Iraq also supported the efforts to maintain population growth. The fertility rate rebounded back to 7 children per woman after the revolution. Then, a demographic revolution occurred. The truly massive population growth of the early 1980s, close to 5% annually, which was among the highest in the world, started to seriously threaten the ability of the state to keep its population fed and sustained. The Islamic leadership of the country had to acknowledge the secular problems stemming from the unbridled population growth. They performed a complete turnaround and reopened the clinics set up by the previous regime. The first state-funded condom factory in the Middle East was opened in Iran, and sexual education was enacted in schools. They had the Islamic law on their side, since the approach of the Islamic doctrine towards contraception is actually not by any means rigidly hostile. While there was a vocal opposition against these measures by the conservative hardliners, the family planning policy turned out to be incredibly successful. The fertility rate declined from nearly 7 children per woman to under 2 in less than 20 years. That is the fastest decline in fertility rate in recorded history anywhere in the world. And it parallels the development in a country that few people would likely consider similar to Iran, communist China. In China, Mao's regime also started as fiercely pro-natalist, but then bowed to the fears of overpopulation and potential famine. And as in China, the regime then started having second thoughts about its approach, since they feared it might be a little too successful. The supreme leader Ali Khamenei said that he is shaking with fear over the aging of the population and its low fertility rate. He is introducing a 14-point program to encourage the birth rate, including free maternity wards, longer maternity leave, and a move not only to end free vasectomies, but to make them illegal. Former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad declared, quote, "I'm against saying that 2 children per woman are enough. Our country has a lot of capacity. It has the capacity for many children to grow in it. It even has the capacity for 120 million people. Westerners have got problems, because their population growth is negative. They are worried and fear that if our population increases, we will triumph over them." End of quote. As in China, these attempts to raise the fertility rate will almost certainly be to no avail. The success of these regimes in swiftly decreasing fertility rates shows that the societies were sociologically ready for the process. That, nevertheless, does not mean that Iran is in a comparably bad demographic situation as China. Its fertility rate went sub-replacement, but not massively so. It remains close to 1.7 children per woman, and it briefly went over 2 around 2015, when the massive 1980s generations were reproducing themselves. The anthropological base of Iran is just different from that of China. As we can observe from the ultra-low fertility of the whole East Asian region, as well as the ultra-low fertility of the East Asian diaspora from Malaysia to America, the cultural proclivity to lower fertility is deeply embedded in the culture. That cannot be said of Iranians or other Middle Eastern populations. The Chinese regime also drastically overdid it. They used totalitarian coercive measures and basically banned people from having more than one child. We just made a drop in the fertility that would happen anyway. We can judge it from the low fertility of other East Asian populations, quicker and more pronounced than it would otherwise be, and also deepened the massive issue of gender imbalance caused by the cultural preference for male offsprings executed through female infanticide. The Iranian regime never enacted any measures of such draconian nature, and they would likely cause a massive backlash in its cultural environment. Moreover, the fertility decline would likely be significantly slower without these measures, and the fears of overpopulation and its possible fatal consequences were completely justified. But it still remains one of the paradoxes of modern Iran that the deeply conservative religious revolution produced a regime that enacted measures leading to a fertility rate comparable with the United States or France. Since the longing for the idealized past that is the kickstarter of fundamentalist radicalization is by itself a byproduct of sociological modernization and the slow breakdown of traditional family systems, the political victory of the Islamic Revolution paved the way for cultural defeat. Today, the Islamic Republic of Iran is one of the least religious societies in the Middle East. As was already alluded to, Iran will experience significant aging in the coming decades. According to most estimates, the proportion of people over 60 will increase from around 10 to 30% in 2050. That is a pretty drastic change, and it will encompass many well-known issues connected to mass population aging. Iran's median age, now projected to be around 33 years, will be close to 40 at the time. Now, 26 years is not a long time in terms of demographic projections, so unless a massive change in the reproductive behavior of the population happens, these estimates will likely be on point. If there is any drastic change in the reproductive behavior of Iranians, I would bet on it being centered around a further decline of the fertility rate, not its increase. So, Iran is headed to be demographically in a similar shape to some European countries like France today. It will be painful, since Iran is still a comparatively poor country, but it is unlikely to be catastrophic. Due to the still young population age and fertility rate that is rather close to 2 children per woman, its population will grow throughout the period and will likely reach 100 million people before it starts to decline slowly. In that period, Iran still has at least 20 years ahead when it will profit from the demographic dividend that started in the 1990s. Due to the dramatic decline in the number of births in the 1990s, the dependency ratio, meaning the proportion of economically inactive people to people in the productive age, started to massively decrease, and the number is projected to stay low until 2050. The percentage of the Iranian population in the productive age will increase for some time going into the future, before the massive 1980s generations, who now enjoy a life expectancy of 75 years, start to retire. That presents Iran with a window of economic opportunity. It is, however, hard to predict how the complex Middle Eastern and global geopolitical landscape will affect its ability to harvest it. Now, I have already mentioned the large Iranian ethnic and linguistic diversity. More Azeris, people speaking Turkic language but nevertheless connected to Iranians by adherence to Shia Islam, live in Iran than in their nominal nation of Azerbaijan. Another major minority are the Kurds, people speaking Iranian language but adhering mostly to the Sunni branch of Islam, constituting the major religious minority in heavily Shia Iran. However, rather surprisingly, for a geographically and demographically diverse Middle Eastern country, Iran seems to be sociologically pretty homogeneous in terms of reproductive behavior. The fertility rate in the regions inhabited by the most numerous ethnic minorities in the country, the Azeris and the Kurds, is more or less the same as for the majority Persian population. Major deviations from the norm are to be found in the provinces inhabited largely by Arabs near the Iraqi border, and especially in Balochistan and Sistan, near the Pakistani border, where the fertility rate is still over 3 children per woman. These groups, however, comprise very small proportions of the Iranian population, and their population growth thus does not present any major threat to the ethnic balance of the country. That stands in contrast to Turkey, another major Muslim country that has already reached sub-replacement fertility, where the country is sort of divided into 3 distinct demographic zones on a gradient from northwest to southeast. Now, as was already mentioned, Iran now likely is one of the least religious societies in the Middle East. While official censuses are unlikely to provide reliable information due to the authoritarian nature of the state, there are independent sociological surveys that reveal that the grip of Shia Islam on society is massively weakening. In a sociological survey executed by a Netherlands-based survey organization focused on Iran, only 32% of the population described themselves as Shiite Muslims, while 44% of the population described their religious belief as non-existent, agnostic, atheist, or spiritual. Interestingly enough, almost 8% of the population answered that they are Zoroastrians, an ancient pre-Islamic Persian religion, that might perhaps be interpreted in similar terms as the growth of the pre-Christian pagan faiths in some European countries, where people look for ways to boost their national identities in forms connected to pre-Abrahamic religious beliefs. However reliable these statistics might be, the secularization of Iran is likely very significant. As usual, these shifts are most pronounced among the urban youth. The fertility rate in Tehran stands at 1.3 children per woman. I do not dare to guess the future of the regime in Iran, but significant changes might be on the horizon. However, an American historian of Iranian ancestry, Arash Azizi, in a recent interview claimed that while the regime is not popular among most of the population, there isn't any relevant and sufficiently organized power that could potentially replace it at the moment. The future of Iran in the new demographic reality will be highly interesting. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, or consider supporting me on my Patreon or on my Buy Me a Coffee page. Thank you very much.